Let's continue to head to Asia now for what I call the beast in the East. It is perhaps going to be one of the most important international organizations, not just of Asia, but of the entire planet in this century / the coming centuries. It's so wildly important, but it's still so brand new that most of you have never even heard of it. Let's change that. Of course, I'm talking about the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now, the Shanghai Five, as the original 5 members were called, got together in 1996. That's not that long ago. And they signed a Treaty of Deepening Military Trust in Border Regions. Well, that's a mouthful, too. And why did they do this? Why would these states get together at this particular time? Well, first off, who were the states? The Shanghai Five original were Russia, China, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. Why would they sign a treaty on military trust in 1996? Keep it in historical context here. Just 5 years earlier, in 1991, the Soviet Union had imploded and collapsed and dissolved. So you went from a singular USSR sovereign entity to 15 new sovereign states, including all of those Central Asian countries. That used to be part of the Soviet Union. Now they're independent sovereign states. But of course, they still have a lot of collaborative military stuff going on with the Russians. They used to all work together under the USSR umbrella. So it was in the Russian strategic interest to maintain those ties in countries now that were heavily armed but independent. And the Russians and the Chinese, throughout most of the Cold War, had an on-again, off-again relationship where they were mostly allies, never fast friends. But here in 1996, with a new age dawning, the Russians and Chinese got together with these Central Asian states and said, you know what? We have a lot of military power between us. Hell, the Russians and the Chinese are nuclear armed countries. And China has the largest standing army on the planet. And all of these states have hell tons of Soviet weaponry in them. So they said, let's get together for this deepening military trust to reduce frictions between each other, to make sure nothing goes wrong. Because guess what? We have more in common than we have against each other. In fact, we have a hell of a lot in common. And indeed, along the same theme, they reinforced that concept in 1997 by signing another treaty called the Treaty of Reduction of Military Forces in Border Regions, again, between themselves. They're saying, hey, let's start strategically thinking about working together militarily as a singular unit, which means we don't have to have all of our troops stationed across the borders from each other. Let's start thinking as a singular whole, not as 6 independent states. And indeed, they did become the Shanghai Six in 2001 when they allowed Uzbekistan to join. It's at this time, actually in 2001, that they also renamed the entity from the Shanghai Five to the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now, these 6 full members of the SCO have been joined by 4 more observer states. They're not full members, but observer states. Many people believe they eventually will become full observer states. The 4 observer states are India, Iran, Mongolia, and Pakistan. Wow! Now you're starting to talk about a serious Asian bloc going down here. Indeed, these 6 full members, just the full members, account for about 60% of the Eurasian landmass. That's most of Eurasia. And when you count the 4 observers and the 6 for the 10 states in SCO, that accounts for over half of the Earth's current population. Wow! Half under this singular military / defensive / security umbrella. This is very significant. And again, it's still brand new. It still has the training wheels on. They're still evolving. They're not even sure what they are yet. So it's got a long way to go. But it was based on this joint military / defensive cooperation idea. Now, let's flush that out a little bit more. They themselves, the SCO says, hey, we're not trying to be a NATO yet. We're not forming some sort of war club. We're not getting together so we can all be on the same team. They say we are primarily centered on our member states working together to address security-related concerns. We're going to work together for 3 particular security-related concerns. 1, terrorism. 2, extremism. And 3, separatism. Okay, now this is interesting. Now, the terrorism and the extremism, that's no surprise. Every country fights against terrorism and extremism. They don't want radicals cropping up, and everybody in the world is after terrorists now. There's a world war against terrorism led by the United States, and NATO fights against terrorism. That's what they're doing in Afghanistan. The EU fights against terrorism and extremism. So that's not that new that you would have groups of countries working together as a common goal to stop terrorism or extremism or violent anything. The separatism, I think, is very unique. I don't know of any other entity that in its constitution, in its charter says, yes, we, the sovereign states working together in this club, vow to protect each other's sovereignty, protect each other's territorial integrity by working together to fight against separatism. Maybe I haven't made it clear why this is so important, because these 6 states have said, hey, Russia's basically said to China, dudes, look, we know you're the #1 fan of sovereignty. And so we're telling you in the SCO that we as a member state will help you fight against separatism in your country. So not only do we recognize that Taiwan and Tibet are part of sovereign China, but if Tibet tries to break away, we as an SCO member have vowed to help you stop that. That is radical and new. And in return, China says, thank you, Russia. And if Chechnya tries to break away from Russia, the Chinese have said, yes, we will come help prevent that. So the whole idea of separatism being one of the foundation blocks of this security arrangement is quite unique and quite new. Please jot that down. I think it's really, really important. Again, that's just within the 6 member states that they're going to try to prevent separatism, but also fight against terrorism and extremism. However, evidence is growing that the activities of this SCO group are expanding rapidly in various other social development directions simultaneously, and this is happening fast. They have started to broaden cooperation on issues like overall security, crime. They're talking about building a legal framework to extradite criminals and help each other's police forces between the member states. That's crazy new. And they're even going to have joint task force to fight drug trafficking across the entire SCO area. And this is quite important, I can tell you, my friends, because just off the cuff, Afghanistan is the #1 producer of heroin on planet Earth. Most of that heroin goes to Russia and China. So obviously, this SCO grouping is going to say, hey, we're going to work together to stop that from happening, and lots of other criminal activities and separatist activities or rebel activities. So you see that this is kind of a bizarre amalgam of lots of different stuff going on here. Now, to stop all of those things from happening, they're also increasing their activities to include increased intelligence sharing and counter-terrorism programs across all 6 countries, and perhaps even the observer states eventually. So this is growing and growing and growing. And now let me get to the cherry on the cake. Increased SCO joint military exercises and military cooperation. Booyah! Now we're getting to something that looks a hell of a lot like NATO. You mean the militaries are working together? Yes, they have just started. They're not all the way there yet, but they have had several joint military operations, war games, if you will, where the militaries of these 6 entities have gotten together and had their tanks come out there and fighter jets do patrols and maneuvers with each other. That is serious, serious Asian shit, my friends. And it's going down now. And I gotta tell you, the very first war games they had about 5 years ago, they cut right to the chase. They're very blunt. And the first war game scenario, they said, okay, scenario 1 for our SCO military exercises. Let's pretend that a small group of terrorists in one of our states has blown up something over in another state, somewhere, let's say Europe or America. And then let's pretend that one of those European states or America decided to invade one of our states to get that small terrorist group. Now, let's have a joint military exercise to repel the Western country that tried to come in to our state. Woo-hoo-hoo-hoo! Now, you don't know why I'm laughing. What I've just described is the U.S. and Afghanistan. They have been very open in saying, hey, this kind of is a defensive pact much like NATO. Much like NATO Article 5. They haven't outlined it in an exact way yet, but they have suggested we will not allow any military incursions from outside of our SCO bloc into any of the member states. Obviously, nobody's going to invade Russia or China, but somebody might try to invade Tajikistan. And the Russians and Chinese and the whole SCO group have said, we're not going to let that happen. This is a new world. This is a new bloc of Asian power that's not going to allow the rest of the world, mostly the Western institutions, come into their backyard anymore. Again, it's new. I'm excited about it because I want you to understand and know and remember this stuff. But don't let my excitement, don't let my rising blood pressure overstate the realistic rendition of what's happening here. They are nowhere near as organized as NATO yet. They have nowhere near the level of intelligence sharing as the EU or NATO or the Western institutions do yet. But they're working on it. The mere fact that they're starting it is what's exciting and new about it, and very important for the evolution of not just Asia, not just this bloc, but world power structures and current events worldwide. Now, it's even more than that. As if I haven't just about given myself a stroke talking about the military stuff. They want to do more on economic fronts too. At a meeting about 5 or 6 years ago, the Chinese premier, and I know you know who he is, Wen Jiabao, proposed as a long-term objective of the SCO to establish a free trade area. Whammo! Boom! So now you have the SCO that's kind of like a NATO structure, and now they're kind of like an EU structure or a NAFTA structure, pulling in new duties. Russia, at the same meeting, also suggested that the SCO form an energy club where they will, the member states, prioritize joint energy projects, including building infrastructure and helping each other develop oil and natural gas fields. And this is quite important because Russia and those Central Asian states actually control over half of the world's natural gas. What's interesting about a country controlling over half of a resource, or a group of countries controlling over half of a world's resource? Because you can form a cartel, much like OPEC is to oil in the Middle East. So now we have the SCO that's maybe an OPEC type of deal in Asia for natural gas. So we have multiple things going on here. Now, in fact, I got to tell a little side story here because it's just too hilarious to not. And that is, at this meeting where Vladimir Putin was, because the heads of state and the main premiers actually come to these SCO meetings. So premiers, prime ministers, and presidents attend these things. And of course, Vladimir Putin being the president of Russia from 2000 to 2008 and still the prime minister now, he still attends these meetings. And he said, after this energy club statement, a reporter said, hey, President Putin, I have a question. So if you guys are talking about joint projects and all this stuff, are you guys going to form some sort of like cartel based on natural gas? Is the SCO going to evolve like an OPEC of Asia for natural gas? And here was Vladimir Putin's response. Oh, no. Oh, for goodness sakes. What are you talking about? That would never happen. Now, here's how I interpret that event. Vladimir Putin never laughs. Never. In fact, when he does laugh, it's probably the last thing you're going to hear before the icy hand of death snuffs you out. So his overplaying this, to me, gives it credence that it probably is going to happen, and at least they're talking about it. And even if they're not talking about forming up a cartel in which they could set the prices for natural gas worldwide, just the SCO states, they certainly are working together in infrastructure and developing each other's oil fields and gas fields, because China wants a lot of this stuff. So this is economic levels keep piling up here in this SCO grouping as well. Now, to stay with Vladimir Putin and kind of sum up why the SCO is so important, Vladimir Putin and the leaders of China, being major international power players in their own right, have really kind of made it clear that they see the SCO as much, much, much more than any of the individual things which I've now outlined. Yes, it's kind of like an Asian NATO. Yes, it may become kind of an Asian OPEC. Yes, it may be a free trade bloc, kind of like an Asian EU. But they are saying, hey, here's the deal. Altogether, the SCO will probably become a major power player on planet Earth as a singular bloc that is an alternative to the Western-dominated ones which currently run the whole damn show in the world. That's what's so damn important about it. They're not saying we're an anti-NATO or an anti-EU or an anti-OPEC. They're saying, no, we're just the Asian version of these things. And as Asia's power grows, as China continues to grow, and India, and ASEAN, and Japan, this is where the true center of economic growth and vibrancy and perhaps military and political power is rising. And the SCO is positioned to be the major entity in control. Woo! And this, of course, will create all sorts of stability between the states. Kind of imagine it as kind of an ASEAN plus a NATO, and almost like a plus a UN just for Asia. And again, they're suggesting we did not create the SCO to counter NATO per se. And we didn't create the SCO so that we have a big fighting force so we can come attack you. It's not about that. Yes, it might be about competition, but it's more about an alternative, the Asian alternative. Does that make a little bit of sense? Not just counterbalancing all the Western institutions, but providing a completely different alternative that will be the center of power, the power block that these players with increasing voice in the world will be running. They don't want Western influence there. They don't want the Western institutions to have a say there or to come in and overpower their rising economic and political clout in the world. In fact, one of the main reasons they created the SCO was that they saw the U.S. as the sole superpower back in the early 90s with perhaps too much power. And all of those Western-dominated institutions like the United Nations Security Council, like the IMF, like the World Bank, and these Asian entities, including Russia, said, why the hell do the Europeans and the Americans have all the power? This is bullshit. We need to start thinking Asian way. We need to create our own so we don't have to rely on those guys. And it is unfolding fast, my friends, very fast. Not just militarily, not just economically, even financially. The Russians and the Chinese have been hinting that they would like to shift away from world reliance on the US dollar as the main currency of the planet. I mean, that's the kind of shift I'm talking about, much less all the other stuff. Do you see how important this is? This is a strategic entity which is going to grow in power for the rest of your lives. It's still a baby. It still has the training wheels on. And again, to re-stress how they want to do it their way. They don't want influence from the United States. They don't want those Western institutions in there dominating them. The United States has actually applied for observer state status to the SCO every year for a decade. And they've been denied every year for a decade. Repeat, the U.S. has tried to get into the SCO meetings and been denied entry into the clubhouse. That is telling you something that's going on here. Oh, and back to my point. One of the reasons they created the SCO was the rising power of the United States and then the forthcoming wars in Afghanistan and then Iraq, that a lot of these SCO states said, hey, we want to make sure that that doesn't happen in our backyard. Because guess what? Asia's our backyard. What the hell's the U.S. doing here? What's NATO doing here? This part of the world should be influenced and controlled by us, the Asian states. And not to be a deserter of NATO or the U.S., both entities I love, they got a point. It is their backyard. They should be the ones in Afghanistan. And if NATO and the U.S. leave Afghanistan, watch for Russian and Chinese and possibly an SCO contingent to fill that void and go in and do something. That's the shift I'm talking about. So as Asian power players continue to rise in the 21st century in economic, political, and military power, this is going to continue to grow in our lifetimes. Look to the SCO to become the major, if not the only major power block in Asia that is pulling and binding all of these states together. And I'll end on this. Think about SCO, even though it's dynamic, it's new, it's young, it's feeling its way out still, and I've told you all these different things they do, kind of consider SCO like this. We talk about ASEAN as an economic bloc that's growing and might have half the world's population in a free trade bloc. ASEAN is to Asia kind of like what EU is to Europe, economically, binding states together to trade with each other, bringing stability. So ASEAN is to Asia what the EU is to Europe, and the SCO may become to Asia what NATO is to Europe and the United States and the Western world. Does that make a little sense? I sure hope so. I know I get all excited about it. I want you to be smart about what's happening on the planet, and this one is one to know for the rest of your life. It's still a baby. It's got a long way to grow into its Asian giant final form.